Hola, por favor, and I welcome all of you back to another Christian Cwiki article. And I want to do this sort of like in two versions. So first, you're going to be seeing this done in English, and then I actually want to do this in Espanol because just as a quick little thing to get into this, I absolutely love the idea of doing videos in different languages, just because I think it's a really unique challenge. And to be fair, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll say this just before we get started proper, is that I think that actually learning new languages is one of the most rewarding and actually kind of therapeutic things that you can really challenge yourself to do, because there's such a great way to pronounce certain things, and the way that certain words that just mean the same thing are said in just such a different and almost a very romantic way. I could give you a rundown of all the languages that I've learned and attempted to learn over the years, from French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Russian, and a lot of I'm still trying to learn English and all the rest of it. But when it comes to Chris, Spanish is ironically something he took really, there was a period in which he seemed super invested in this. So without further ado, and because it's been 10 whole years since I took my very last compulsory French class, here we go. Chris and Spanish. Spanish is a Romance language with over 489 million native speakers. It is also a common second language choice for millions more, including our favourite linguistic autistic, who knows un poquito but still acts like a fluent speaker. He often uses Spanish in his videos and comics, as it was one of the few things that he learned at Manchester High School, however, poorly. He often refers to himself by his Spanish name, Ricardo. Chris is proud of his tenuous grasp of the Spanish language, but this has not prevented racism against Hispanics, creating a stereotypical babysitter in his comics and a highly stereotypical sombrero-wearing Pokemon named Espalonic, who confuses its enemies with its language. Okay. Based on his vocabulary, and the fact that it's the most common Spanish dialect taught in American high schools, Chris most likely learned the standard Latin American dialect. Chris's knowledge of the language. Chris's actual grasp of the language must be inferred from various sources. The Manchester High leaks and his Hotel Ricky Ricardo project indicate that Chris took Spanish 1 in his junior year from 98 to 99, and Spanish 2 in his senior year from 99 to the year 2000. His grades are unknown, but he seems to have done well enough to pass both classes. On OkCupid, Chris claimed to speak Spanish and wrote a large section of his profile in it, which was riddled with mistakes. He also states that he speaks Spanish on his resume, but mentions that he has only taken 2 years. You could probably learn a lot about Spanish in 2 years. I learned when I was learning about Italian. I learned a lot in just less than 1 year, but that's besides the point. But mentions that he only takes 2 years. He has also written some Sonichu comics in Spanish. Chris seems confident in his Spanish, despite plentiful evidence suggesting his grasp of it being feeble. He frequently makes mistakes of grammar, spelling, and pronunciation, and only employs the most basic of verb conjunctions, such as the present indicative. Don't know why that was so hard to say. Chris never expressed interest in taking classes or other instruction beyond high school to reach fluency, nor has he deliberately practiced his Spanish with native speakers. He seems to view his Spanish skills as a means of showing off and not a communication tool, which, yeah, it does. That makes sense. And speaking of this, what was this written with with Ay Caramba? We tres were enjoying la fiesta. Okay, that's. I literally only had to take like one look at that, and I thought to myself, that's the kind of thing that wouldn't even pass for like hang on, we may have gone a bit too far forward. There we go. That's the sort of thing that wouldn't even pass in the really early Tom and Jerry cartoons. You know what I'm saying? Some of Chris's mistakes in Spanish seem to have crossed over from his stunned command of English, such as an affinity for the written sequence ein, resulting in, for example, bien instead of bian. Chris is inconsistent with his use of symbols which do not occur in English while writing Spanish, such as an inverted punctuation, accented vowels, and most significantly, the N. I don't technically know exactly how to pronounce this, but yeah, I'm not going to lie when I say that there's something particularly mañana about the way that I use Spanish, only because I've very, very, very rarely had anything to do with actually speaking to, outside of Argentinians, Uruguayans, and maybe, no, Brazilians don't really count because that's Portuguese, so there we are. That it may be prove something to learn when I come to actually do this. I even have like a small dictionary on Spanish as well, which is interesting, I guess. The inverted punctuation marks are sometimes replaced with their respective upright marks and accents with an apostrophe before the vowel. While the tide in N is often omitted entirely, the fact that he sometimes uses the proper characters indicates that he knows how to enter them and simply does not care enough to do so consistently. In some of Chris's Tongo-era Spanish writing, notably Sonnetu Issue 12, Chris uses feminine nouns and adjectives when referring to mixed gender groups, whereas Spanish grammar rules dictate using the masculine plural in these contexts. This could be an attempt at a subtle feminist statement, but knowing Chris, it was simply a simple error. In Chris's July 29, 2009 video to our True and Honest Hero, he displays his grasp on Spanish, basic as it may be. It can be safely assumed, however, that he used online Spanish dictionaries for words he did not know. He also mispronounces one of the most common Spanish vowels, buen, good or well, as bueno. Another video involving Spanish is U8C43P2A37A8Y UC U8C1N023V0L, a weird 1337 Spanish title, in which he says love Sonichu and hate Aspechu backwards in English, surrounded by a sentence in awkward Spanish. In another display of his Spanish, his old Spanish assignment to create a hotel was released online. This assignment is mostly just basic Spanish and not very well advanced. In Mumble Chat number 2, Chris briefly attempts to have a conversation with a Mexican troll, but fails to understand his question. Has estado en Mexico? Have you been to Mexico? Even after it is repeated multiple times with different wording. Chris probably never learned the present perfect verb tense, or if he did, he is not able to recognize it in its spoken form. Ricardo Weston Chandler. Ricardo Weston Chandler is Chris's Spanish nom de guerre, presumably chosen in honor of a main character in one of Chris's favorite TV shows. Students in language classes often choose an alternative name in the language they are learning to get into the culture and language. Of course, while most people forget about this when they have left the course, or even the teachers abandon the practice shortly into the course, Chris has adopted Ricardo as his actual Spanish name, and uses it for his Spanish-related endeavors. That sounds like the title to a porno right there, Spanish-related endeavors, but we'll just look past that. He is oblivious to the fact that, when learning another language, people generally do not change their name, but instead use the language's native form of the name. If no native equivalent exists, they may adapt it into fit the language's pronunciation and spelling rules, i.e. L becomes R in Japanese. Christian, without the H, is actually a rather common name in the Spanish-speaking sphere. Western can be adapted as Western, or loosely translated as Delester of the West. Chandler can be translated as either Candelero or Valero, depending on which meaning we're going with. Christine becomes Christina, and Christopher becomes Cristobal. Chris has plenty of options. Furthermore, Modern Spanish speakers rarely translate names of non-royalty. Just as English speakers don't refer to every Maria as a Mary, the practice of adopting a Spanish name while learning the language is purely for immersion purposes. It is not a reflection of how native Spanish speakers actually talk, at least not in the 20th and 21st centuries. Of course, it must be noted that Ricardo's linguistic skills have brought us gems such as noviophobia, from the Spanish novio, boyfriend. It should also be noted that Ricardo is the Spanish and Portuguese version of the name Richard, which is sometimes shortened to Dick. Chris's attachment to his Spanish name has not abated to this day, and he has listed the name prominently alongside his more common aliases, Christopher, Christian, and Christine. However, Chris has yet to pick a feminine Spanish name in agreement with his current gender identity, suggesting he has largely abandoned the concept of having a Spanish alter ego. And for what we see right here, even though they're not 100%, these things aren't necessarily like for 100% reading purposes, but this is just all the examples of Chris where he has used Spanish in one way or another. They're not really that like absolutely necessary, but the only things of note, if for any others, is just the fact that maybe this is just Chris either trying to bridge the gap to maybe a different language, to a different audience that speak a different language, or maybe this is just sort of how Chris sort of want. It's a little bit more fascinating at first sight at the idea of the fact that it seemed as if like Chris was actually quite interested in, for the lack of a better term, with the Spanish language. But in practice, it does it makes sense for him. But in theory, it just comes across as though I think Chris went into this with probably the best intentions that he could, and he seemed involved. I get it. I can't really say anything bad for really Chris here. It's just some of his uses of language is a bit obscure, and probably even to somebody who is a bit of a stronger speaker of the Spanish language than I am, would probably go through this by saying that there's just some things that, again, try to break away from like certain stereotypes from sombreros and try to confuse people with languages, and that not everything is done mañana. And, well, yeah, that should be about everything we have to say there. Now, again, as short as this was, I do want to do like a translation, specifically an Espanol video for this, because I think it just would be worth more reading or looking into. So, good luck seeing that video very, very shortly, and I cannot wait to talk to you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.